All right, guys, welcome back. And so for the next section, we're going to start diving into basic survival. Okay. This section is not designed to make you a survival expert or self reliant, but it's just supposed to be enough to keep you safe if you're forced to stay out beyond your normal anticipated time in the field, and where your pack contents might be stretched beyond their limits. For some of you out there, you may be already involved in a lot of day long, 24-hour or more searches. So some of this would be a little bit more applicable to those folks, but for the rest of us, this is you're given an assignment, and either the search goes longer, or there's a need to stretch that urgency out, or something happens in the middle of that search where we really need to check and adjust what we're doing in order to maintain our personal safety. So the first question that I would like to pose as part of this is, when does an extended search assignment turn into a short-term survival situation? And this is an important distinction to make. Just because your search assignment goes beyond that normal 4 to 6 hour range, or that normal 24-hour range, depending on what type of searches you're typically involved in, that does not necessarily mean you've transitioned to a short-term survival situation. Okay. However, there are elements that can pop up, or things that can happen during a search, where you can go from, okay, this is normal, to, all right, we really need to adjust in order to maintain our safety. So for me, short-term survival can be characterized as whenever a searcher experiences a critical deficiency in a life-supporting condition, and the only way to really alleviate that condition is through intervention. We need to do something in order to maintain ourselves through this life supporting this deficiency of a life supporting condition. An example of this could be whenever a searcher is exposed to extreme environmental elements, and the searcher must erect an emergency shelter. You go out there on a search assignment. All of a sudden, you're expecting some conditionings worsening, but they happen a little bit quicker or a little bit more extreme than you perhaps were anticipating. You're not able to get to safety within a critical amount of time. So your best bet may be to stop and hunker down and wait out a situation. So that's what I would characterize as a short-term survival situation, something that you can live out of the contents of your pack, to get through and wait out that situation. Now it turns into a longer term situation if, for whatever reason, you are no longer you're no longer self sustainable through what you have brought with you. You need to rely on the environment to acquire what you need to get through that situation. Then we start to see that transition from short term to long term. Short term can last, up to a few days, depending on the conditions, before that transition to long term can be really a possibility, or something that needs to be considered. But whenever we start really identifying that we need to pull from the environment in order to sustain that critical deficiency in those life supporting conditions, that's whenever I say we've transitioned over to a long term survival situation. So, to help searchers prioritize those life supporting conditions, what we do is we apply the rules of three, and this is a very easy something to remember, to help you prioritize those life supporting conditions. So, for example, here, air. You can go 3 minutes without air. So air is super important. We've only got 3 minutes. That's towards the top of prioritization. Shelter would be the next thing. In extreme conditions, you're looking at about 3 hours of exposure before you need to have shelter. Either that's extreme heat or extreme cold. If you don't have that shelter within 3 hours, you're really putting yourself at risk. Okay. Rest is about 30 hours, about 30 hours on shelter. You can only go so long on your own before your body requires rest, or else you really start to impact your systems, your bodily systems. That rest is important. You can only go for so long. About 30 hours is about where the limits are. For water, you can go about 3 days, depending on the environment. Food, you can go about 3 weeks, depending on the situation there and how well you can preserve and limit your movement, and preserve your caloric output. You can go about 3 weeks, but it all boils down to the last bullet here, and that's how long does it take for a bad decision, for something bad to happen based on a bad decision, based on inadequate preparation, or that lack of that positive mental attitude that we talked about earlier. It can have an impact as little as 3 seconds. You think your situation is, you make a decision that takes your situation from bad to worse. That not thinking through that or not taking that extra 3 seconds as a pause can really impact that ability to execute. And the same thing with a positive mental attitude. If you let despair or you let hope slip away, in that short 3 seconds, you can do something that will have a profound impact on your situation just by not having that positive mental attitude. If we do need to get into a situation where we need to purify water or look at purifying water, there are some things that we can do, that we can bring with us and to make this where we can consume water safely. The best mitigation, honestly, is against waterborne illnesses is by packing enough water into the field. And I've stressed this enough previously in the equipment part of this, but whatever you can do to pack enough water into the field with you, that's your first option always. You don't necessarily want to have to resort to doing this. It may happen, and I've done it in the field before. But the best way to keep yourself safe and prevent getting a waterborne illness is by packing enough water with you. Untreated water can contain pathogens such as bacteria like E. coli or salmonella, and viruses like a norovirus or hepatitis that can be transmitted in water. If you do need to purify water in the field, flowing water is your preferred option because it's not as conducive for algae growth or microorganism accumulation. You will want to look for that clear flowing water, and it's not necessarily just safe to drink right out of the stream. That was always a misnomer that I heard growing up. That is, if it's clear and it's flowing, it's safe to go ahead and drink. That's not necessarily the case. We still need to treat it. We need to still need to purify it. But that's your first choice when selecting a water source, is that clear flowing water. If you don't have any clear flowing water, calm water without a lot of sediment is your next best choice. That calm water without a lot of sediment is your second best. But what you want to do is you want to try to collect that water as far away from the shore as possible, as microorganisms tend to accumulate in higher concentrations near the shore. So the further that you can reach out and extend safely without going into the drink, but to reach out there and collect that water, the further that you can get out there, the better. You want to avoid water near heavily populated areas or near animal grazing areas. So if it's next to farmers' fields where there may be some chemical runoff, certainly not your best option there. If you see a lot of animal traffic around the water source, not a great option either, just because of from animal waste or the bacteria or viruses that animals may have. They can easily transmit to us. So if you see a lot of that activity, you may want to select a different water source. And if you see a lot of foam or brown scum on top of the water, you want to avoid that as well. These are nutrient-rich environments for microorganisms. So if you see a lot of foam, that's not an area where you want to go and collect your water. So do be very careful whenever you're selecting that water source. There's a lot of belief that purification and filtration are interchangeable. They're used interchangeably at times, but make no mistake, they're not the same thing. Okay, purification and filtration are not the same thing. Filtering the water out will take out some of the sediment. It can take out some of the sediment. It could take your if you do it right, you can take your brown water and get it kind of clear, and get some of the big stuff out. But that's not the same thing as purifying it. Purifying is going through processes to remove any harmful bacteria, viruses, some chemicals and stuff like that. That's what we talk about whenever we talk about purifying. If you do need to purify water in the field, boiling water is the most reliable method. And I've heard different stuff over the years in terms of how long you need to boil the water. I've heard anywhere from just getting it to a boil. If you just get it to a boil, you've killed the bacteria and the virus is there. I've heard boil for a minute. I've heard for boil for 10 minutes. And having not really personally tested this myself or any desire to really test this myself, I would say that if you have enough time to have a need to boil water in the field, I would say let the water boil as long as you can let it go, and then cool it off and make it safe and make it consumable. I don't think you if you're in a situation where you need to bring water to a boil in the field, you're probably not in that big of a rush to get somewhere. You could take a few moments, let it boil, and have that reassurance that it's those viruses and bacteria have been neutralized to the best you can. Pasteurizing the water is not a preferred option. Pasteurization is where you bring it up just barely up to the point of boiling, not quite to boiling, but it's heated up very much so where it's on the brink of boiling. That's pasteurizing it. I would say go ahead and wait the extra time, bring it to a boil, give it a couple minutes, so that way you can feel more confident about that. Like I said, me personally, I'm not going to test any of those theories on which one more effectively kills the bacteria or viruses. My philosophy on it is if I have brought myself to need to boil water in the field, I'm going to let it boil for just a few minutes. If I've gone that far, I'm probably not in that big of a hurry. So let it boil, give it a couple minutes, and then of course let it cool before you do anything with it. But boiling water is your best bet. You can chemically treat a water with chlorine or iodine tablets. These are also effective. It will impact the taste. So if you prefer that route, it's beneficial to grab those little flavoring packets and pour those in there just to kind of neutralize that taste just a little bit. The big thing with treating with chemicals is you really need to pay close attention to those instructions. There's a fine line of underutilizing and then over applying the chemicals that can make you sick. But they are effective though. They are very much effective. You just really need to pay close attention to those instructions and follow those closely. UV lights are also an effective method. I would, and just with the studies I've seen, they seem to be super effective. I've always been a little bit weary. If you want to go the UV light route, that's fine. I would consider it in tandem with another purification method. I would consider it in tandem with something else, just to make sure that everything has been effectively neutralized. With filtering the water, you can filter the water a number of different ways. The best and easiest way to do that is with a personal water filter, something like a Life Straw or a Sawyer. I personally carry a Sawyer Mini with me into the field. Big fan of Sawyers just because they can screw onto a water bottle, or if you have the hydration bladder, they can tie into your tubing system. They can connect in there easily to filter that water out. But Life Straw is another good tool as well. Both certainly have their benefits of bringing in the field. They're lightweight. They're ultra portable. They're a good add to your pack. They're excellent, quick options, convenient. Make sure you do your research on those as well. They'll tell you what pathogens they can and they can't remove. And I would always say that if you're getting to that point of needing to bust out a water filter, I would really consider purifying that water as well. So use that in tandem with some other purification method. So that's how we would handle water purification in the field. The next thing I want to talk about is emergency shelter building. And of course, just like with water, adequate preparation is going to be your best mitigation against an adverse condition. So if you wear appropriate clothing, that's your best mitigation from a shelter perspective. Wear good clothing, dress for the weather, current and predicted. There are times whenever you need to consider an emergency shelter. If conditions are deteriorating or your clothing is not going to adequately protect you from a worsening condition, that's a time whenever you need to really consider an emergency shelter. Another area too that's probably talked about less. If you're stuck somewhere or you need to wait something out for whatever reason, it may not be due to the environment, but you need to wait for something, and you may be there for a while. Having a shelter or something set up can provide a little bit of comfort while you're waiting out a situation. So having that available, a place to kind of go to, feel safe, that may be a situation there where you can consider an emergency shelter as well. So some things to consider whenever you do put a shelter together, or you pull a shelter material from your pack. Consider the heat retention or the convection. Consider the convection, the airflow moving in and out of the shelter. What's going to pull heat out, or what's going to keep heat in. Think about your insulation from not only on top but also from below. And I've always been told that if you can put about 6 inches of compressed insulation below your shelter in the form of leaves or debris or something underneath of your shelter, get you about 6 inches off the ground. That's going to give you quite a bit of insulation. And then on top, if you can top that off with some branches or something to provide a little bit of insulation on top, that'll go a long way. You want to consider your protection against rain or snow. You want to consider what is it going to take for you to stay dry inside of that shelter. The pictures we have here, there are a couple of options that are easily impackable that you could take out there in the field with you. The first one here being the emergency bivy sack. This is something I carry in my pack. It's something whenever it rolls up, it's not very big at all. I think I've actually got mine stuffed inside of a canteen cup right now inside of my pack. But it's lightweight, it's portable. It's basically it's a nice little sack that you could crawl into. It's gonna retain that heat very, very well. It's gonna give me some protection from rain or snow. It's not the most comfortable thing in the world, but in an emergency situation, it's something that it's ready there and available to me. Another thing that you can pack put in your pack that'll give you a little bit of rain and snow protection is a small tarp like this. Small tarp like this. It doesn't have to be a super thick mill, heavy duty tarp. I think the one I've got in my pack is like 6x8, and it's a thinner mill material, so that way it's lightweight, it's flexible. It's not the most robust shelter that I'll put together out there in the field, but if I'm looking to get through a night or maybe even a couple days, it'll get me through on that. Okay. But most importantly, it's going to allow for runoff of that rain or that moisture, the precipitation that's coming down and protect me from the top. It's also going to retain that heat really well inside of that shelter. And you can see here with the way that this shelter is built in the design, it's very low to the ground. And so by having it low to the ground like this, you're limiting where air can go. Okay, you're doing a good job of trapping that air. There's not a whole lot of places for that air, that warmth and that heat to escape. So that's a good example right there of how you can build the shelter and construct it in a way where it can retain that heat very well. Another thing to consider is look at the location where you've selected to build your shelter and think to yourself, is this a safe place to build this shelter? Look overhead to see if there's any dead limbs or there's any potential deadfall trees nearby that may come down on you, any widow makers. If you're near water, think about the creek rising. If it were to rain really heavy tonight, what's the water going to do? Is this going to flood me out of my shelter location? So if you do have to put up a shelter, think about where you are, what's around you, what can make your situation better, but also what can make your situation worse. And then the last thing to consider is the speed in which it can take you to put that shelter up. If you're really in an emergency situation and you need to get the shelter up quick, you may not have the time to devote to building the shelter that you want necessarily. So think about speed. Think about what's going to get me to a place of safety the quickest. What can I leverage in the environment to make that transition quicker or better? You may be a very accomplished shelter builder, but if it takes you a few hours to get there and you don't have that much time, you really need to rethink your strategy kind of going into it. In terms of the material, consider something like a bivy sack, which is what we have in the top left, an emergency blanket, one of those Mylar blankets. They do a pretty good job too. In a multiple areas, they can be a very good something that you can line your shelter with to retain some heat. You can wrap yourself in it and give you a little bit of protection. It's not going to be much, but it'll give you a little bit of something But those emergency blankets, they're lightweight, they're compact, they have a lot of versatility. Definitely something you should consider whenever you're putting stuff in your pack that could be used as emergency shelter material, even a small tarp. For those of you that are used to having longer duration searches, you probably already have a really nice bivy sack or a small tent, something of that nature. Consider the weight on it. How much is that? How much is that going to weigh? Is it going to have the space inside that I'm going to want whenever I'm out there? Usually, if I'm doing any backpacking, I prefer a two-person tent, even though it's just me, just so that way I've got a place to stow my gear, and I've got a little bit of extra room to move around inside the shelter. But the trade-off on that is it's a two-person tent, and I'm the person carrying it, so it's going to have a little bit more weight to it. Okay. So that's what you could think of in terms of design, in terms of material. In terms of design, there are a couple really easy shelters to put together. First of all, I would always recommend simplest is always better. Think about your needs that you have around you, and simple is better. Okay, if you can get away with just doing an emergency bivy, that's fine. Just do that. If you need something like a lean-to shelter that we see here in the top left, something like a lean-to shelter or an A-frame shelter, which we have here. If you need something like that to keep some of that rain off of you, that's what you need to put up. That's what you need to consider putting up. Lean-to shelters are fairly easy to construct. It's very easy to find material laying around to put some kind of a lean-to up to get a little bit of wash, a little bit of wash off of any material of any precipitation coming down and kind of keep you off. Very easy to construct with stuff in your pack and stuff in nature. You can do it with just simply as a poncho, or as they have here with some debris. If you especially if you get really good at building it, where you can kind of layer the doing a shingling effect on your wall, you can really have some good natural runoff from that. And then an A-frame shelter is another one. It's also very easy to construct. It takes a little bit longer. Takes a little bit longer than an A-frame, but it's much better at controlling that airflow. You can see here on the lean-to, you have this wide opening right here, right? You have this wide opening on this one side of your shelter. So consider the airflow. Consider the fact that this is not going to retain heat very well. Now you can get creative on how you retain heat in this situation. You can line the back of this, with a Mylar blanket back here. If you have enough material where you can kind of post up a Mylar blanket, something like here, you can kind of start reflecting that heat back towards that way. You can get creative on how you build this up and retain heat in a lean-to, but this design right here naturally is going to do a much better job at retaining that heat. It takes a little bit longer to prepare, it takes a little bit more know-how, but if you do it right, you're going to stay dry. You're going to keep the rain off of you, and it's going to hold that heat inside very, very well. So most SAR missions are not going to require you to improvise a shelter, but this is something you should always, in the back of your mind, consider, especially if you're out searching in a remote area and you potentially could have a long mission assignment. This is something that you should have at least in the back of your mind. What's my plan if I'm going to be out here overnight? What am I going to do? Okay. All right, let's talk about fire building next. And I'll start with the same question here. When should you consider building a fire on a SAR mission? It's very similar reasons than we just had on the emergency shelter building. It may be for warmth. It may be a comfort thing. We may need it for signaling if we are in distress or we need to get somebody's attention. We can use it for signaling. Probably the biggest thing would be water purification. That would probably be the biggest need outside of warmth that you would have to build a fire on a SAR mission. If for whatever reason you need to purify water, being able to build a fire quickly and efficiently is really key out there. But at any rate, whenever we start talking about building a fire, there's 3 elements needed to generate fire. You need to have oxygen. You need to have a fuel source, and then you need to have heat. You need to have a spark. You need to have something to get the fire going. Okay. those you need to have all three of those elements present to get a fire going: oxygen, fuel, and a spark. With the material that you're going to need, let me clear off my little lines here. For the material that you're going to need, you need to accumulate this material before you start your fire. You need to have an adequate amount of each of these before you start your fire, because if whenever you get it started, you'll be amazed by how quickly it'll burn up. Okay, so if you don't have enough stockpiled ready to go, then your fire is not going to do very well. You want to start off with having a good platform. A platform is going to be a dry, level surface with adequate airflow, and we'll have a good picture here. I think next, kind of showing you. But these rocks, these rocks could be a good platform. They look kind of wet in the picture, but it's a rock or a cleared out little space on the ground, an area that air can move in and out of. It's dry, so that way it keeps your material dry. That's what you kind of want. You want to kind of clear it from anything that's combustible. You want to clear your area away from anything that's combustible because once it catches, it burns as long as it's got the spark, the oxygen, and the fuel. It's going to keep going. And it's going to keep spreading. So having that platform, that defined area, is crucial. Your fire is going to start off with your tinder bundle. And in this picture, they actually have a couple different tinder bundles here in the example. The first one being over here on the right is more traditionally what I think of whenever I think of a tinder bundle. And it's a collection of very leafy, dry, airy, extremely flammable material that's easily going to catch a spark. So think of dried grass. Leaves do an okay job, but dried grass is better. A lot of folks will carry dryer lint or cotton balls in their pack. A very, very popular and easy technique is if you have cotton balls and some Vaseline, it catches the spark and the Vaseline holds that flame and gives the rest of your fire a chance to catch on. But you build up the tinder bundle by collecting it, compacting it, and you kind of fluff it up. And what you want to create is basically looks like a bird's nest whenever you're done. It looks like a little bowl and a little. It's got a little spot, in the middle for you to hit your flame, your spark in there, and that way it creates a just with the way it's constructed, it's going to hold that flame. So even if it is a little bit breezy, if you get it inside of the bowl, if you get the spark in there, it's going to have a little bit of protection from around it. It's really going to give it a good chance to catch on. And then the airflow going through it, it's dry, it's going to burn quickly. The whole idea of the tinder bundle is it's something that's going to catch that spark, and it's going to have enough fuel to generate a good flash for you to add more material to. This on the left, I would still kind of consider it in that tinder stage. It's not as quite as it's not going to catch as good as stuff on the right, but this is something that you would add on top of that, again, to sustain that just a little bit longer as you add more fuel to the fire. The next material that you would add to the fire is what's called your kindling. In this picture, your kindling is represented here, and maybe to a lesser extent here. I don't have anything for scale. This guy here, he's almost big enough where he could be considered main fuel, but it could also be considered kindling as well. But kindling is material that's slightly denser than a tinder bundle, and it's easily going to capture and hold that flame. So you're thinking sticks, twigs, feather sticks, which is what we have down here on the bottom right. These are called feather sticks, and we can talk about different ways to different materials and different techniques for getting a good fire going. And a feather stick is a technique used to add these little curls or those little shavings to a larger stick. The idea being that the curls will easily catch the flame. And whenever they burn down to the larger stick, it adds a little bit of sustainability behind it. And then lastly, your main fuel, which is what I think they're going for in the picture here, top right, is your main fuel. So the main fuel, it's larger material that's going to sustain that fire whenever it's generated. The big thing again is you want to make sure you have ample stockpiles of this before you get started. So that way, whenever you do get going, you're not scrambling around trying to find dry wood. You're not scrambling trying to find something to keep the fire going. Have your things in your place, mise en place, and be ready to add to the fire at the right stages of it. Whenever we talk about arranging the material, there's plenty of different techniques for how you can arrange the material. They're all based on the same theory that you start in the center with your spark, with your tinder and your kindling, and then you build out to your main fuel. Providing adequate airflow is another thing too. You want to have dry material, but wind and having air to it is really what's going to keep that fire going. It needs to have that to keep going. Whenever you arrange that material, you want to make sure that you arrange it before you ignite. I was a scout as a kid growing up, so the TP method here was the primary method that we use in the scouts growing up. But the idea is you put your tinder bundle and your kindling all here in the center. You build up around it and stack it up in this TP, and you ignite that, and it takes off after that. Okay, so that's the theory about how that works. You build around that kindling and that tinder ball underneath of there, but there's adequate airflow, and while the fire is in this fragile state, while your kindling and your tinder is burning, the rest of the structure is going to protect it from the elements. So that's part of the reason why you want to have that built beforehand, and that way it can go ahead and start catching whenever it reaches that stage. Having that stockpile is huge. So that gets us through that piece of it. Now there's whenever you can turn your fire into a bit of an offensive tool for you, and use your fire to signal as well. So to signal with fire, you need to add material to it that's going to produce a lot of smoke. And depending on the environment, you may want black smoke or you may want white smoke. If you're wanting black smoke, this will be like if you're in an area with, you're trying to catch help from further away, or the conditions are snowy outside. You may want black smoke, and it's a little bit harder to generate black smoke from nature, from natural materials. So you need to add, rubber or synthetic material, oil, something to it that's can generate that black smoke. Nature, the material available in nature is really good at producing a white smoke, which is good if you're in a heavily vegetated area and you want to put up a white signal across a green backdrop there. It's very easy to see from long distances away. But you want to add green leafy vegetation to that fire, and that's going to generate that white smoke. It's a lot easier to generate white smoke than it is black smoke with the material in nature. So keep that in mind. While we're on the subject of signaling, there are a few different ways to signal for help while you're out there. The first would be electronic signaling, and this is probably what we're all most familiar with. Just about everyone carries either at least a cell phone of some variety, if not a smartphone, where you can actually send your coordinates or show somebody where you're at, connect a phone call, send a text, or even FaceTime, depending on how strong your signal is. But having your smartphone available, or having a phone available, is probably your number one method of getting something out to somebody. Having a radio is number two, obviously. But there's a fewer number of people listening on the radio, and there's a lot. Depending on where you're at, you may have a little bit less luck with the radio as you would with the phone. But there's trade off on both of those methods. Some of your victims, if you are in this game long enough, you may be looking for downed aircraft at some point in your career. Most general aircraft carry what are known as electronic locator transmitters, or ELTs, on board. And the purpose is there is they can cast that distress signal in the event of an accident, and it can be triggered either manually or automatically. Some of them are configured to be triggered whenever a crash is detected. Others, it requires a manual trigger to initiate the signal. But in either case, upon activation, what happens is a GPS signal is transmitted and is received by the Air Force Rescue Coordination Center. That's who takes that signal, and they will start to coordinate a search and rescue mission based off of that signal activation. Personal locator beacons are another form of electronic signaling. They work very similar to ELTs, but they are carried by individuals. These are carried by individual people. And just like with ELTs, whenever they are activated, they transmit a distress GPS signal, but it's bounced around a little bit different than an ELT. ELT is going to go to the Air Force Rescue Coordination Center with a personal locator beacon. What it's going to do is it's going to be picked up. The signal is going to be picked up by the closest receiving station, and these are called local user terminals. Whenever that's picked up, they forward the call to the closest mission control center, and eventually it's passed along to a rescue coordination center where a search and rescue mission is coordinated. So it takes a little bit different path whenever it bounces around, but it will eventually land in the hands of someone that can act, respond to a search. The caveat with personal locator beacons, and I've seen it I've read a lot of cases about someone going missing and they were known to carry a personal locator beacon, or maybe they attempted to use it and something happened, but it relies on the user to activate the unit. So the user has to be aware that they are in trouble, have the presence of mind to remember that they have the personal locator beacon available to them, and they have to activate it. And it's also on the responsibility of the user to maintain that beacon. So it's up to them to make sure it's got full battery strength, or it's ready to go whenever they need it. I've heard stories of people, they go out to activate their beacons and just to find the battery's dead. So it's not a foolproof something. You can go out there and purchase one if you do a lot of backwoods fun and outdoor activities. But it's on you to make sure that it's properly maintained, and it's on you to activate it whenever need be. Okay. So moving on to visual and audio signaling. This is, from an audio perspective, that's using your whistle or using an air horn. From a visual perspective, you can use, your flashlight. A signal mirror is another really good tool. Most signal mirrors, whenever you buy them, they'll have the instructions on how you use them on the back. But basically, whenever you have your signal mirror, you'll take two fingers on your opposite hand, and you'll move the mirror back and forth so that way you can shine the light and cast it through the V that you make here. And basically, what you're doing is you're making a rifling sight, and then you can put that on your target and toggle that mirror back and forth to get the attention. And they work really well. There are some that have a really nice polished finish on them, and they are super bright whenever they whenever they hit your eye. So signal mirror is a really good tool. Flashlight's another good tool. Some of them have you can activate them into an SOS mode, automatically go ahead and signal. Chemical sticks are another good tool as well. I mentioned maybe in the last module that you can take a chemical stick and you can pop it and drop it in like one of those, like a white shopping bag, and it creates like a lantern effect. Another thing you can do is tie a chemical stick to like a piece of paracord or a rope, and you can twirl it around. You can twirl it around, and it creates like a little ring. It's very, very catchy. It gains a lot of attention whenever you do that. But chemical sticks do a pretty good job of signaling as well. And then in terms of if you start seeing things in three or hearing things in threes, that's whenever we have an international that's the international standard for a distress signal. Something in a group of three whistle blows, three maybe hits on a tree, or three gunshots, something of that nature. That's a distress signal. Whenever you start seeing groups of three, that should clue you in that something there is going on. Moving on to whenever it's not a common thing that happens, but I have seen it happen on a number of occasions, and that's whenever a team or a team member becomes lost, and it's not necessarily the most flattering thing in the world whenever search and rescue has to go out and look for the search and rescue person, but inevitably you will come across people in your SAR career that have an exceptional talent for putting themselves in bad situations, even to the point where they will somehow manage to get lost on their own. To avoid being that person, you being that person, there are a few things that you can do to avoid from getting lost. And the first thing is sticking with your team. Whenever you're out there on a team and you're moving, you're grid searching through an area, or you're hasty searching through down a trail or whatever, maintain a visual line of sight. Make sure that you can see the person next to you, and preferably they can hear you. Maintain the visual line of sight at all times. We don't want to send anybody out on their own. Nobody should ever go out on their own. So make sure you have a visual line of sight. Make sure you can maintain voice communication with somebody. That way they know where you are and you know where they are. The second thing was just have some general spatial awareness. Understand where you are. Understand how to get to and from the command post whenever you leave it. Just have an understanding of where you are spatially in relation to things that you know. How did you get into an area? What's the plan for getting out of an area? Understand those things as before you get into the field. Consider some kind of a passive signaling option. Whenever we say passive signaling, you can clip like a small strobe light to the back of your pack, or I've seen some that like on their headlamp, they may have a strobe on the back of their headlamp that they're using. So some kind of a strobe, or put some kind of something that's going to make a lot of noise on your pack, like bells or something. That's how you introduce some passive signaling. It doesn't take any effort to activate; it's already going, and it's easy to see and hear. And then lastly, carry signaling gear. Carry a whistle and use it. Just if you are not sure about where you are in relation to somebody else, do a whistle blow. Try to get someone's attention so that way you can stick with your team better. Okay. If you do become lost, which it's inevitably going to happen to either to someone that you know on a mission. It could even happen to yourself. Sometimes it is easy to get disoriented out there. It's very rare that you may have to that you may have that situation. But if you do, treat it like a short-term survival situation. And the best thing for you to do is stop, and that's an acronym that we use to get you to stay put. Don't attempt self-rescue. I know it's embarrassing. It's an embarrassing thing to go through, but don't attempt self-rescue. If you truly are lost and you don't know where you are, sit down. It's the same thing we teach kids in the Hug a Tree program. Don't put more distance between yourself and rescue. Hug a tree and survive. Okay. If someone realizes that you're not there, luckily search and rescue is already there on standby. They will have a good idea of kind of where you are. They can come get you. The next thing to do is think. Understand what your immediate needs are. If there's a worsening condition to think about, what do we need to do to account for that? If think about what your immediate needs are. Go back to that prioritization that we talked about a few slides back. Observe what can improve your situation in the immediate area, and what can be detrimental. What can make your situation worse? Are you in a place where you can be rescued? Are you in the best place to be rescued? We obviously want you to stay where you are, but think about, by staying, am I putting myself in any danger where I'm at? Okay, so observe where you are, observe the environment, think about what you need to do to protect yourself, and then lastly, plan. If you need to put some kind of a plan in motion to enter a short-term survival situation, go ahead and do that. If you need to put up a shelter, build a fire, go ahead and start putting that plan into motion. Be confident in your skills and your training to address your immediate needs, and always consider those what ifs. What if this happens? Do I have what I need for that? Okay? And that wraps us up on the basic survival portion of this module. Thanks for listening in.